For 35 years, I was the invisible daughter, the one whose graduation photos never made it to the living room wall, the one who sat at the corner of every family dinner while my parents gazed adoringly at my younger sister Sabrina, their golden child, their miracle, their everything. So when my father called and demanded I attend Sabrina's wedding, his voice cold as January ice, I wasn't surprised. But his next words made my stomach drop. If you don't show up and behave, we're cutting your tuition. You'll never finish that degree. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. They didn't know. None of them knew. Not that I'd graduated 2 years ago valedictorian. Not that I was making 6 figures at a Manhattan firm. Not that I'd been silently watching them lie about supporting me while every dollar went to Sabrina. They thought I was still struggling, still dependent, still nothing. But as I stood in that church vestibule watching my father straighten his tie, I reached into my purse and pulled out a single white envelope. What would you do if your family never truly saw you? My name is Monica Jennings and I am 35 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst at one of the most respected firms in Manhattan, earning a salary that would make my parents' jaws drop if they ever bothered to ask about my life. But they never did, which is exactly why I found myself driving down that familiar tree-lined street in suburban Boston, preparing to face a family that had spent 3 decades pretending I barely existed. The house looked the same from the outside, the white colonial with black shutters that I had grown up in. But the moment I stepped through the front door, I realized everything had changed. The living room had been transformed into a shrine dedicated entirely to my younger sister, Sabrina. Wedding photos from the engagement shoot covered every available surface. Sabrina laughing. Sabrina posed elegantly against a sunset. Sabrina gazing adoringly at her fiancé. I counted 17 framed photographs before I stopped counting. I walked slowly along the wall, searching for something, anything that acknowledged my existence in this family. Finally, behind the china cabinet, partially obscured by a decorative vase, I found it. A single small frame containing my high school graduation photo. The glass was dusty and the frame was chipped at the corner. I had graduated summa cum laude that year. No one had attended the ceremony. "Monica, you made it." My mother Patricia emerged from the kitchen, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a wedding planning binder clutched to her chest. She offered me a brief, distracted hug before immediately turning back toward the dining room. "We're just finalising the seating chart. Sabrina's side has so many important guests." My father Richard appeared from his study newspaper tucked under his arm. He looked me up and down with that familiar expression of mild disappointment. "Still working on that degree, haven't finished your MBA yet." He shook his head slightly. "Education is important, Monica, but at some point you need to actually accomplish something." I felt my chest tighten but kept my expression neutral. They genuinely believed I was still struggling through graduate school, dependent on whatever minimal support they imagined they were providing. The truth would have stunned them into silence, but I was not ready to reveal it. Not yet. Dinner that evening was an elaborate affair, though not in my honour. Sabrina arrived with her fiancé Jason Whitmore III, heir to a prominent Boston family with connections in law and finance. My parents practically glowed in his presence. The entire conversation revolved around the wedding, the Whitmore family's vacation home in the Hamptons, and how fortunate Sabrina was to have found such a perfect match. I watched Jason carefully throughout the meal. He was handsome in that polished patrician way, with perfect manners and a ready smile. But something about him felt rehearsed, distant. He laughed at my father's jokes a beat too late. His eyes wandered when Sabrina spoke about their future. He was performing a role I realised just as I had performed mine for years. After dinner, I was assigned to clear the table, while everyone else retired to the living room to admire more wedding materials. Some things never changed. "Your attendance at this wedding is an obligation to this family," my father announced when I rejoined them, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "There is no option to be absent." My mother nodded in agreement, then added something that made my ears perk up. "Oh, and do remember to thank Aunt Margaret when you see her. She just lent us quite a large sum to help with the wedding expenses. Very generous of her." I kept my face carefully blank, but inside my mind was racing. Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, whom Patricia had always dismissed as the eccentric spinster of the family, was now funding Sabrina's lavish wedding. 6 months ago, Margaret had sent me an email hinting at family financial troubles. I had come here to confirm my suspicions. Now, I had my answer. But something told me the debt ran far deeper than a single wedding loan. The next morning confirmed everything I had suspected about my place in this family. I woke early, hoping for a quiet cup of coffee before the chaos began, but my mother was already stationed at the kitchen table, with her wedding binder open and a yellow legal pad filled with tasks. She barely looked up when I entered the room. My father sat across from her reading the financial section of the newspaper, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Sabrina was nowhere to be seen, presumably sleeping in as the bride-to-be deserved her rest. "Perfect timing," my mother said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. She tore a page from the legal pad and slid it across the table toward me. These are the things we need handled today. The florist needs someone to confirm the centerpiece arrangements. The venue coordinator has questions about the table layout, and Sabrina needs her dress picked up from the alterations shop by 3 o'clock. I looked at the list. There were at least 15 items, each one more time-consuming than the last. "This is a lot to handle in one day," I said carefully. "Maybe we could divide some of these tasks among everyone." My mother's expression hardened. "Sabrina is the bride. She cannot be running around town doing errands. And your father and I have important meetings with the Whitmores this afternoon." I just meant that some of these seemed to conflict with each other. The florist is on the opposite side of town from the dress shop, and they both need attention at almost the same time. My father lowered his newspaper and fixed me with a cold stare. "You still need us to pay your tuition, Monica. So, I suggest you lose the attitude and figure out how to make it work." His voice carried that familiar edge of authority that had silenced me countless times throughout my childhood. "We have done a great deal for you over the years. The least you can do is help your sister have a perfect wedding." I felt the anger rising in my chest like a wave, hot and urgent. They had no idea. They genuinely believed they were funding my education, that I was still that struggling graduate student who depended on their generosity. The truth sat on the tip of my tongue, ready to explode into the room and shatter their smug assumptions. But I forced myself to breathe, to swallow the words back down. This was not the moment. I was here to gather information to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Reacting emotionally would only give them ammunition. "Fine," I said quietly, taking the list. "I will handle it." My mother nodded, as if this outcome had never been in question. My father returned to his newspaper without another word. I spent the morning racing across town, checking items, off the list one by one, playing the role of the dutiful, overlooked daughter they expected me to be. By early afternoon, I had completed most of the tasks and returned to the house exhausted and frustrated. That was when I saw Aunt Margaret's car in the driveway. She was sitting in the backyard when I found her alone on the old wooden bench beneath the oak tree, where I used to read as a child. Margaret had always been different from my mother. Where Patricia was polished and concerned with appearances, Margaret was practical and direct. She had built her own wealth through smart investments after her husband passed away 15 years ago. My mother had always referred to her as the family spinster, despite Margaret being far more financially secure than my parents had ever been. "There you are," Margaret said warmly as I approached. She patted the bench beside her, and I sat down gratefully. "I was hoping we could talk privately." "Mom and Dad are at their meeting with the Whitmores," I said. "Sabrina is getting her hair done for some pre-wedding photo session." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes studying my face with that perceptive gaze I remembered from childhood. Did you read my email, the one I sent 6 months ago? I did, I admitted. That is part of why I came. I needed to see for myself. Margaret let out a long breath. Then, you know your parents are in trouble? What you may not know is how deep that trouble goes. She paused, glancing toward the house to make sure we were truly alone. They owe me $80,000 for this wedding alone. I wrote them a check because your mother begged. She said they would pay me back once Sabrina married into the Whitmore family, as if their daughter's marriage was some kind of business transaction. $80,000. The number hung in the air between us. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower. Over the years, they have borrowed from me repeatedly. For Sabrina's college, her apartment, her car, that trip to Europe she just had to take. They always promised to repay me, and they never did. The total debt is closer to $150,000. I felt dizzy. My parents, who had always presented themselves as comfortable and successful, were drowning in debt they had accumulated entirely for Sabrina's benefit. And they still had the audacity to threaten me with cutting off support they had never actually provided. Margaret reached over and took my hand in hers. Her grip was firm and reassuring. Monica, you cannot let them define your worth forever. I have watched you shrink yourself to fit into this family for 35 years. It is time you start living for yourself. Her words hit something deep inside me, something I had buried for so long I had almost forgotten it existed. Before she left, Margaret pressed a small envelope into my hands. This is a copy of all the debt documents, every loan, every promise, every dollar they owe me. She met my eyes with an intensity that surprised me. When you are ready, you will know what to do with it. I took the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt light, but I knew the contents carried enormous weight. I did not yet know how I would use this information, but I understood that everything was about to change. And if $80,000 was just the wedding, what exactly did $150,000 of desperation look like? The question haunted me as I drove across town the next day, running yet another list of errands my mother had thrust into my hands at breakfast. The car was quiet, except for the hum of the engine, and in that silence, memories I had long buried began rising to the surface. I found myself thinking about all the times I had been invisible in this family, all the moments when I had needed them, and they had simply not been there. I was 8 years old when I won the top student award at my elementary school. It was the biggest achievement of my young life, and I had practiced my acceptance speech for days. But when I walked across that stage to receive my certificate, I looked out at the audience and saw 2 empty seats where my parents should have been. They were in Connecticut that day, driving Sabrina to a piano competition. My teacher had to give me a ride home afterward. When my parents finally returned that evening, my mother glanced at the certificate and said it was nice before launching into a detailed account of how wonderfully Sabrina had performed. At 14, I begged for violin lessons. Music had become my escape, and I dreamed of playing in the school orchestra. My father sat me down and explained that money was tight, that they simply could not afford the expense of lessons and an instrument. I accepted this because I believed him. But that same summer, Sabrina was sent to a prestigious arts program in Paris. 6 weeks in France, all expenses paid by my parents. When I asked how they could afford that, but not my violin lessons, my mother told me to stop being jealous of my sister's opportunities. The memory that cut deepest came when I was 18. I had worked tirelessly throughout high school, maintaining perfect grades while holding down a part-time job. When the acceptance letter arrived from one of the top universities in the country, along with notification of a full scholarship covering tuition, room and board, I ran downstairs to share the news. I expected celebration pride, maybe even tears of joy. Instead, my father looked up from his newspaper and said, "Good, that's one less thing we have to worry about." My mother nodded and returned to helping Sabrina choose a dress for her junior prom. Not a single word of congratulation. Not one acknowledgement of everything I had achieved. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, letting the weight of those memories settle over me. Then I went inside and climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom. My mother had asked me to organise some old boxes to make room for wedding gifts, and I had agreed because it gave me access to parts of the house I had not seen in years. The boxes were stacked in the closet, filled with old documents my father had apparently forgotten about. Tax returns, bank statements, financial records dating back over a decade. I began sorting through them, methodically, looking for anything that might confirm what Aunt Margaret had told me. What I found was worse than I had imagined. My parents had always claimed they supported me financially throughout college and graduate school. Every phone call included some reference to the sacrifices they were making to help me succeed. Rent money, living expenses, textbooks, emergency funds. According to them, they had spent over $60,000 keeping me afloat while I pursued my education. I had believed them. I had carried guilt about this supposed debt for years, but the bank statements told a different story. I traced every transfer, every check, every payment made during the years I was in school. Not a single dollar had been sent to me. Not one. Every transfer during those years went directly into an account under Sabrina's name. The payments they claimed were supporting. My education had actually funded my sister's lifestyle. Her apartment, her car, her shopping trips, her vacations. I had paid for everything myself through scholarships, part-time jobs, and student loans that took me years to pay off. They had not just favoured Sabrina. They had lied to me for over a decade while using my supposed financial dependency as a weapon to control me. My hands were shaking when I left the house an hour later to pick up cake samples from a bakery downtown. I needed air, needed space to process what I had discovered. The coffee shop next to the bakery was nearly empty when I stepped inside, so I ordered a cup and sat down to collect myself. Monica Wright. I looked up to find Jason Whitmore standing beside my table, a coffee cup in his hand, and an uncertain smile on his face. Without Sabrina beside him, he seemed different somehow, less polished, more human. "Yes," I said. "And you're Jason, the groom." He laughed awkwardly and gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Mind if I sit for a minute? I'm hiding from wedding planning chaos." I nodded and he sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You're Sabrina's older sister," he finally said. "She rarely mentions you. I didn't even know she had a sister until a few months ago." Something flickered in his eyes as he said this. Confusion, maybe, or doubt. "That doesn't surprise me," I replied carefully. He opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could speak, the coffee shop door swung open and Sabrina swept inside like a storm. Her eyes locked onto us immediately, and her expression shifted from surprise to cold fury in the span of a heartbeat. "There you are," she said to Jason, her voice sweet but her eyes sharp. She took his arm possessively and pulled him to his feet. "We have appointments, remember?" As she guided him toward the door, she glanced back at me with pure contempt. "Don't bother my future husband's sister." But I had seen something in Jason's face before she pulled him away. Doubt. Questions he was too polite to ask, but clearly wanted answered. That night, I spread everything across my bed. Aunt Margaret's envelope, the bank statements, the transfer records, the evidence of a lifetime of lies. $60,000 they claimed to have given me. $0 actually sent. Every single penny had gone to the golden child. The evidence of their lies stayed with me through a restless night and into the next morning when my mother announced that I would be accompanying them to Sabrina's final dress fitting. I had not been invited to any of the previous appointments, so I knew immediately that my presence served some purpose beyond sisterly bonding. I dressed quickly and followed them to an upscale boutique in the most exclusive shopping district in Boston, the kind of place where the sales associates wore designer clothes and spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Sabrina was already there when we arrived, surrounded by 3 of her closest friends, and a woman I recognized from photographs as Eleanor Whitmore, Jason's mother. Eleanor was elegant in a way that spoke of old money and careful breeding. Her silver hair was swept back in a perfect chignon, and her eyes took in everything without revealing anything in return. She nodded politely as we entered but said nothing. The boutique had been reserved exclusively for Sabrina's appointment. Champagne flowed freely, and the staff fluttered around my sister like she was royalty. I stood near the back of the room trying to make myself as small as possible when Sabrina suddenly called out my name. "Monica, come here," she said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that always preceded something cruel. "I have an announcement." I walked forward reluctantly, aware of every eye in the room turning toward me. Sabrina smiled brilliantly at her audience. "I've decided that Monica will be my honorary bridesmaid. Every family photo should have both sisters in it. Don't you think?" She paused, letting the moment land before adding, "It's not like she knows anything about fashion, but at least the pictures will look right." Her friends giggled. My mother nodded approvingly. I stood there, absorbing the insult while maintaining a neutral expression, a skill I had perfected over 35 years of practice. But Sabrina was not finished. She turned to Eleanor Whitmore with an exaggerated sigh. "Poor Monica, 35 and still single, still in school. Some people just aren't meant for success, I suppose. Not everyone can be lucky like me." The laughter from her friends grew louder. I waited for my mother to say anything, in my defence. Instead, Patricia shook her head with what she probably thought was maternal sympathy. "Monica has always been shy. She never learned how to network properly. Some children just don't have that natural social grace." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. I had endured worse from this family. I could endure this. Eleanor Whitmore had been watching the entire exchange in silence. Now she spoke for the first time, her voice calm and measured. "Miss Sabrina, what does your sister do for work?" The question hung in the air. Sabrina's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Oh, she's still figuring things out. You know how it is. She's finishing her graduate degree," my mother added quickly, stepping in to cover for Sabrina's obvious ignorance. "Business school, very demanding program." Eleanor's eyes shifted to me, and I saw something flicker in her gaze. Interest, perhaps, or suspicion. She studied me for a long moment before returning her attention to Sabrina's dress, but I had the distinct impression that she had filed away that interaction for future reference. The fitting continued for another hour, during which I was measured and prodded and discussed, as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to match the decor. When it finally ended, I thought the ordeal was over. I was wrong. On the drive home, my parents asked me to pull over at a quiet side street. My father turned in his seat to face me, his expression hard. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "You will do everything Sabrina asks between now and the wedding. Everything. You will smile, you will help, and you will not cause any problems." "Richard is right," my mother added. "This is the most important day of your sister's life. If you do anything to ruin it, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences, I asked, keeping my voice steady. My father's eyes narrowed. "If you don't cooperate fully, don't expect us to pay another cent toward your education. We've sacrificed enough for you over the years. It's time you showed some gratitude." My mother nodded. "You should be thankful your sister even included you in the wedding party. Most brides wouldn't be so generous to a sister who has contributed so little to the family." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would penetrate the fortress of their delusions. They genuinely believed they had supported me, sacrificed for me, given me everything. The evidence in those bank statements meant nothing because they had constructed a reality in which they were generous parents, burdened by an ungrateful daughter. When we arrived home, I excused myself and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the windows up, finally alone for the first time all day. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. The number on the screen stared back at me. $87,000. My savings from 2 years of working a 6-figure job in Manhattan. Money I'd earned entirely on my own without a single dollar of help from the people who claimed to have given me everything. They thought they had leverage over me. They thought their threats about tuition meant something. They had no idea who I had become while they were busy worshipping at the altar of their golden child. I sat there for a long time staring at that number, thinking about everything I had discovered in the past few days. The debt they owed Aunt Margaret. The lies they had told about supporting me. The contempt they had shown me in front of strangers. The way they had erased my existence from this family while demanding my gratitude. Something shifted inside me. A door that had been closed for 35 years finally swung open. I picked up my phone and dialed Aunt Margaret's number. She answered on the second ring. "Aunt Margaret," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm ready. Tell me everything about that debt." Aunt Margaret lived in a modest but elegant townhouse in Cambridge, a place she had purchased with her own money after her husband passed away. I arrived at her door the next morning, 5 days before Sabrina's wedding, carrying the envelope she had given me and the bank statements I had found in my parents' closet. She welcomed me inside without a word and led me to her study, a warm room lined with books and filled with soft morning light. "Sit down," she said, gently gesturing to a leather armchair across from her desk. "We have a lot to discuss." I sat and waited while she gathered her thoughts. Margaret had always been the black sheep of my mother's family, the sister who never married the right man or said the right things at parties. But sitting in her home surrounded by evidence of a life built entirely on her own terms, I understood that she had simply refused to play by their rules. I admired her more in that moment than I had ever admired anyone in my family. "The $80,000 for the wedding is just the most recent loan." Margaret began folding her hands on the desk. "Your parents have been borrowing from me for over 15 years. It started small, a few thousand here and there to help with unexpected expenses. But it grew. Sabrina's study abroad program in Paris when she was 14, her first car, the down payment on her apartment in the city, that European vacation she took last year." She paused and met my eyes. "Every major expense in your sister's life has been funded by loans from me. Loans your parents swore they would repay, but never did." "How much?" I asked, though part of me did not want to know. "The total accumulated debt is approximately $150,000. The number landed like a physical blow. $150,000. My parents, who had lectured me about fiscal responsibility my entire life, who had made me feel guilty for every dollar they claimed to spend on me, were drowning in debt they had accumulated entirely for Sabrina. "They promised to repay me once Sabrina married well," Margaret continued, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice. "That was always their plan. Raise her to be perfect, invest everything in her future, and wait for her to marry into money. This wedding to Jason Whitmore is not just a celebration. It is their retirement plan. They are gambling everything on this marriage." I thought about the way my parents had paraded Sabrina in front of the Whitmores, the careful cultivation of her image as the perfect bride from the perfect family. It all made terrible sense now. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice softening. "Something I need to tell you directly." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "When your parents applied for these loans over the years, they submitted financial statements. I saw their bank records, Monica. I know the truth about how they treated you." My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "Your parents told everyone, including me at first, that they were sacrificing so much to support both their daughters. They talked constantly about the money they were sending you for school, for rent, for living expenses. They made themselves out to be martyrs." Margaret's expression hardened. "But the bank records told a different story. Every dollar they claimed was going to you was actually being transferred to Sabrina. They never sent you anything, not a single cent." Hearing it confirmed by someone else made it feel more real. I had suspected, then discovered, but part of me had still hoped I was wrong. Now that hope was gone. I paid for everything myself, I said quietly. Scholarships, part-time jobs, student loans that took me years to pay off, and the whole time they were telling people they were supporting me. I know, Margaret said, and I am sorry I did not say something sooner. I should have. But I was afraid of causing a family rift, and I convinced myself it was not my place. She leaned forward. I'm saying something now, and I am offering you a choice. She opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. This is called an assignment of debt. It is completely legal. As the creditor, I have the right to transfer the debt your parents owe me to another party. The debtors do not need to consent. They simply need to be notified in writing. She looked at me steadily. If you agree, your parents will no longer owe me $150,000. They will owe you. The implications of what she was offering settled over me slowly. My parents, who had controlled me with threats of cutting off support they never actually provided, would suddenly find themselves in my debt. The power dynamic that had defined my entire life would be completely reversed. Why would you do this? I asked. Margaret smiled sadly. Because I have watched you shrink yourself for 35 years, trying to earn love from people who are never going to give it. Because your parents used my money to build a throne for Sabrina while treating you like a servant. And because I believe you deserve the chance to finally stand as an equal in this family. I looked at the documents, my mind racing. This was not about revenge. I did not want to destroy my parents or ruin my sister's wedding. I just wanted to be seen. I wanted them to acknowledge even once that I existed as more than an afterthought, that I had value beyond what I could do for Sabrina. I'll do it, I said. I'll accept the transfer. Margaret nodded and began preparing the paperwork. As she signed the final document, she paused and looked up at me. There is one more thing you should know. Eleanor Whitmore has hired someone to investigate your family's background. The Whitmores are very protective of their reputation. If Eleanor discovers the true extent of your parents' debt before the wedding, she may pressure Jason to call everything off. I understood immediately. This wedding, the one my parents had bet everything on, was built on a foundation of lies, and I was now the only person who knew exactly how fragile that foundation was. The knowledge of that fragile foundation stayed with me as I drove to meet Aunt Margaret's lawyer 2 days later, 3 days before Sabrina's wedding. His office was located in a stately brick building in downtown Boston, the kind of place where serious business was conducted behind heavy wooden doors. Margaret had arranged everything in advance, so when I arrived, the documents were already prepared and waiting for my signature. The lawyer was a silver-haired man named Robert Chen, who spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades handling delicate family matters. He walked me through each document, carefully explaining the legal implications in plain language. An assignment of debt is a straightforward transfer of creditor rights, he said. Once you sign these papers, your parents will legally owe you $150,000 instead of owing your aunt. They don't need to agree to this transfer. The law only requires that they be notified in writing. I picked up the pen and signed my name on each designated line. With every signature, I felt something shift inside me. For 35 years, I had been the powerless one in my family, the daughter whose existence was tolerated rather than celebrated. Now, with a few strokes of ink, I was claiming power I had never possessed. The formal notification will be sent after the wedding, Robert said as he gathered the signed documents. But you are free to inform them yourself whenever you choose. The transfer is effective immediately. I thanked him and left the office carrying my copies of the paperwork. The afternoon sun was warm on my face as I walked to my car, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to calm. The legal work was done. Now I needed to prepare for what came next. I spent the rest of that afternoon assembling the contents of a single white envelope. First, I printed a copy of my MBA diploma from the prestigious business school I had attended on a full scholarship. The word valedictorian was printed in elegant script beneath my name. My parents had never seen this document. They had not attended my graduation. They did not even know it had happened. Next, I added my employment verification letter from my company in New York. Senior financial analyst, it read, with an annual salary of $180,000. I had earned this position through years of hard work and dedication climbing the corporate ladder without any help from the family that claimed to have sacrificed everything for me. Then came the bank records I had discovered in my parents' closet. Page after page of transfers all directed to Sabrina's account during the years they claimed to be supporting me. I had highlighted the relevant entries and calculated the total on a separate sheet. Over $60,000 they said they had given me. $0 actually sent. Finally, I placed the debt transfer confirmation on top of the stack. $150,000 now owed to me instead of Aunt Margaret. I sealed the envelope and wrote nothing on the outside. The contents would speak for themselves. The following morning, I visited an upscale boutique I had noticed during my errands around the city. A sales associate approached me with the slightly condescending smile I had grown accustomed to receiving in expensive stores. That smile faded when I told her exactly what I was looking for and made clear that price was not a concern. I selected a navy blue dress that fell just below the knee, elegant without being flashy. The fabric was beautiful, but understated the cut, flattering without trying too hard. This was not a dress meant to outshine the bride. It was a dress that said I belonged in any room I entered. I paired it with simple jewellery and classic heels that added just enough height to change my entire silhouette. When I looked at myself in the fitting room mirror, I barely recognised the woman staring back at me. For my entire life, I had dressed to disappear, choosing clothes that would help me fade into the background of my family's attention. This dress did the opposite. It demanded to be seen. I paid for everything without hesitation and returned to the hotel room I had booked for the wedding weekend. I could not stay another night in my parents' house surrounded by Sabrina's photographs and the constant reminders of my invisibility. The hotel was neutral territory, a place where I could think clearly and prepare myself for what was coming. That night, I sat alone on the edge of the hotel bed with the white envelope in my hands. The room was quiet, except for the distant hum of city traffic outside the window. I thought about what tomorrow would bring: the wedding, the family gathered together, the moment when I would finally show my parents who I had become. I did not want to destroy Sabrina's wedding. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in the idea of ruining what should have been a happy day. But I also could not continue living as a ghost in my own family, dismissed and diminished while they used fictional stories of their generosity to maintain control over me. I wanted them to see me. Really see me. Not the struggling daughter they had invented to make themselves feel like martyrs, but the successful woman I had built myself into without any help from them. After 35 years of being invisible tomorrow, I would finally exist. I slept more peacefully that night than I had in weeks. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that photographers dream about. I took my time getting ready, applying makeup with careful precision and styling my hair in a way that framed my face elegantly. When I finally slipped into the navy dress and looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I saw a stranger. A confident, accomplished woman who carried herself like she belonged anywhere she went. I picked up the white envelope, tucked it into my purse, and drove to the wedding venue. The ceremony was being held at a historic estate outside the city, all manicured gardens and stone architecture that spoke of old money and tradition. I parked my car and walked toward the entrance, my heels clicking steadily on the cobblestone path. When I stepped through the doors into the reception hall, where guests were gathering before the ceremony, something unexpected happened. People turned to look at me, not with the dismissive glances I was accustomed to receiving, but with genuine curiosity and interest. I saw heads tilt toward each other, whispers exchanged behind raised hands. Not a single person recognized the failure they had expected to see. I moved through the reception hall with a calm I had never felt before in this family's presence. Guests milled about in small clusters, champagne glasses in hand, admiring the elaborate floral arrangements and the sweeping views of the estate gardens. I recognised a few faces from my parents' social circle people who had attended dinner parties at our house when I was younger and never once asked me a single question about my life. Now, those same people were looking at me with open curiosity, clearly trying to place who I was. A woman from the Whitmore's side approached me near the refreshment table. She was elegantly dressed in pale pink with diamonds at her throat that caught the light. "I don't believe we've met," she said warmly. "Are you a friend of Sabrina's from work?" "I'm her sister," I replied. The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Oh, I had no idea Sabrina had a sister. She's never mentioned you." She recovered quickly and smiled. "Well, you look absolutely stunning. That dress is gorgeous." Before I could respond, another guest joined us, then another. Within minutes, I found myself at the centre of a small group of Whitmore relatives, all of them complimenting my appearance and asking polite questions about my life. It was the most attention I had ever received at a family event, and I found myself standing taller with each passing moment. That was when Eleanor Whitmore made her way toward me. The crowd seemed to part for her naturally, a testament to the respect and perhaps fear she commanded. She stopped directly in front of me and studied my face with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Miss Jennings," she said, "we met briefly at the dress fitting, though I don't believe we were properly introduced. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, Jason's mother." "I remember," I said. "It's nice to see you again, Mrs. Whitmore." She tilted her head slightly. "What field do you work in? You carry yourself very professionally. There's something about the way you hold yourself that suggests someone accustomed to boardrooms." I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, my mother appeared at my elbow, as if summoned by some maternal radar for controlling the narrative. "Oh, Monica is still finishing her studies," Patricia said quickly, her smile tight. "She's been in graduate school, very focused on her education." Eleanor's gaze shifted between my mother and me. Her expression remained polite, but something flickered in her eyes that suggested she was not entirely convinced. "I see," she said slowly. "Well, education is certainly important." She looked at me one more time before excusing herself to greet other guests, but I caught the slight narrowing of her eyes as she walked away. My mother gripped my arm the moment Eleanor was out of earshot. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Why are you dressed like that? This is Sabrina's day." Before I could answer, my sister herself appeared in the doorway of the bridal suite, her face flushed with anger. "Monica, in here, now." I followed her into the room where she had been preparing for the ceremony. The space was cluttered with makeup cases, hairstyling tools, and the massive white dress that hung on a rack in the corner. Sabrina slammed the door behind us and whirled to face me. "What exactly are you trying to do?" she demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Steal my spotlight on my wedding day? Show up looking like that, making everyone ask questions about you?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time I did not feel the familiar urge to shrink away from her anger. "You're the bride, Sabrina. I'm just a guest. I got dressed appropriately for a wedding. That's all." My composure seemed to infuriate her more than any argument would have. She was used to me cowering, apologising, making myself smaller to accommodate her needs. This version of me, the one who stood straight and spoke calmly, was someone she did not know how to handle. "Just stay out of my way," she finally spat. "And don't you dare do anything to ruin this day." I left the bridal suite without another word and returned to the reception hall. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. Guests were still mingling, but there was an undercurrent of tension that had not been there before. I scanned the room and spotted Eleanor Whitmore leading my parents through a side door into what appeared to be a private study. The door closed behind them, and I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Guests began checking their watches and murmuring about the ceremony start time. Finally, the study door opened and my parents emerged. My father's face was pale, drained of all colour. My mother was visibly trembling, clutching her husband's arm for support. Eleanor Whitmore followed them out, her expression cold as marble. I understood immediately what had happened. The investigation Eleanor had commissioned had borne fruit. She knew something about my family's financial situation. Perhaps not everything, but enough to raise serious concerns about the marriage her son was about to enter. The wedding that my parents had staked everything on was suddenly in jeopardy. My father's eyes swept the room, and when they landed on me, I saw something I had never seen before in his face. Desperation. He made his way toward me quickly, my mother trailing behind him. "Monica," he said, his voice low and strained, "could we speak privately for a moment?" I followed them to a quiet corner near the garden doors. My father glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot before speaking. "Monica, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But you seem to have things together. You carry yourself well. Mrs. Whitmore was clearly impressed by you." He paused and I watched him struggle with what came next. "Is there any way you could help us talk to Eleanor, perhaps vouch for the family? This is a time when family needs to unite." For 35 years, my parents had dismissed me, diminished me, and used me as a convenient target for their disappointment. Now, for the first time in my life, they needed me. And they only realised my value when they were desperate. I looked directly into my father's eyes, holding his gaze, until he looked away first. Then slowly I reached into my purse and pulled out the white envelope I had prepared. "There's something you need to see," I said quietly, "before the ceremony begins." My father stared at the envelope in my hands, confusion and apprehension warring on his face. I led them to a small private room off the main hall, a space that had been set aside for the wedding party. Once inside, I closed the door and walked to the table in the centre of the room. Without a word, I opened the envelope and began spreading its contents across the polished wood surface. First, my MBA diploma. The elegant calligraphy spelled out my name above the word valedictorian. My father picked it up with trembling hands. "This is dated 2 years ago," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. "I graduated at the top of my class. You weren't there because you didn't know it happened, because I stopped telling you about my life years ago." Next, I placed my employment verification letter on the table. Senior financial analyst at one of the most respected firms in Manhattan. Annual salary of $180,000. My mother's eyes went wide as she read the figures. Then came the bank records. Page after page of transfers during my college and graduate school years, every single one directed to Sabrina's account. I had marked them clearly with a summary sheet showing the total. "You told me for years that you were sacrificing everything to support my education," I said. "Over $60,000 according to you. But these records show that you never sent me a single cent. Every dollar went to Sabrina while I worked 3 jobs to pay my own way." Finally, I placed the debt transfer document on top of the stack. "And this," I said, "is confirmation that Aunt Margaret has legally transferred your debt to me. The $150,000 you owe her, you now owe it to me." The silence in the room was absolute. My father sank into a chair, his face grey. My mother stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Finally, Patricia found her voice. "You deceived the whole family," she whispered. "All this time you let us believe you were struggling." I met her eyes without flinching. "Who deceived whom? Mother, you told everyone you were supporting me, while giving every dollar to Sabrina. You used my supposed dependence as leverage to control me. You made me feel guilty for sacrifices you never actually made." Before either of them could respond, the door opened behind me. Jason Whitmore stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. This was no accident, no convenient eavesdropping. His mother had sent him to assess the situation, and from the look on his face, he had heard enough. "So your family's financial situation?" he said slowly, his voice cold, as winter isn't what Sabrina represented to us. Sabrina appeared in the doorway behind him, still in her wedding dress, her face draining of colour as she took in the scene. Her eyes swept across the documents on the table, landing on the debt transfer confirmation. For a moment I thought she might scream or cry, but my sister was too calculated for such displays. Instead, her expression hardened into something icy and controlled. "You'll regret this, Monica," she said quietly. "I promise you that." I turned to face her fully. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Sabrina. I'm doing this because I refuse to be invisible anymore. I refuse to let this family use lies about me to prop up their image." I looked at my parents. "I will send you a repayment schedule next week. $150,000 over 5 years. I will not forgive the debt." Jason cleared his throat. "My lawyer will be contacting Sabrina before we proceed any further. There will be a prenuptial agreement. My mother insists." He looked at my sister with an expression that held none of the warmth a groom should have for his bride. "We'll discuss the details after the ceremony." The wedding happened. I sat in the back row and watched my sister walk down the aisle toward a groom who barely looked at her. Eleanor Whitmore sat rigid in the front row, her face a mask of polite displeasure. When the ceremony ended, she left immediately, without staying for the reception, without posing for a single photograph with the Jennings family. The guests sensed that something was wrong, whispering among themselves as they moved to the reception hall. I stayed just long enough to fulfill my obligation as a family member. I smiled for the few photographs that included me made polite conversation with distant relatives, and watched my parents move through the reception, like ghosts, their perfect day hollowed out by the weight of their own deceptions. As the sun began to set, I slipped away from the festivities and walked toward the exit. Aunt Margaret was waiting for me by the door, as if she had known exactly when I would leave. She pulled me into a tight embrace. "I am so proud of you," she whispered. "You finally broke the cycle." I hugged her back, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time all day. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." The drive back to New York took several hours, but I did not mind. The highway stretched out before me, city lights growing brighter as I approached Manhattan. Somewhere past Hartford, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen and saw Sabrina's name. "You think you've won," the message read. I smiled slightly, pulled over to the side of the road, and pressed a block on my sister's number. Then I merged back onto the highway and kept driving toward home. 3 months later, I stood in my new corner office on the 32nd floor of my building in Manhattan. The promotion to director had come through the week before recognition for years of hard work and dedication. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city spread out below me, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in the eternal dance of urban existence. My phone rang. It was Aunt Margaret. "Your parents made their first payment," she said. "They had to sell your father's car, but they paid on time." I had heard other news through the family grapevine. Sabrina and Jason were in marriage counselling. Rumours suggested he was quietly consulting divorce attorneys. The fairy tale wedding had produced a fractured marriage built on exposed lies. "You didn't just free yourself, Monica," Margaret continued. "You broke a pattern that has been hurting this family for generations. Maybe now they can finally start being honest with themselves." I thanked her and ended the call, then turned back to the window. For 35 years, I had been the forgotten daughter, the invisible one, the family member, who existed only to serve as a contrast to Sabrina's brightness. Now I existed on my own terms, not as someone's overlooked child, but as myself. I finally knew what freedom felt like. Monica's story reminds us of something we often forget in the chaos of family obligations and expectations. Our worth is not determined by how others see us, or by the roles they assign to us. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not because we lack value, but because they cannot see beyond their own needs and desires. For 35 years, Monica waited for her parents to recognize her achievements, to celebrate her successes, to simply acknowledge that she existed. But that recognition never came, and she finally understood that it never would. The breakthrough happened not when her family changed, but when she stopped waiting for them to change. She stopped shrinking herself to fit their expectations. She stopped accepting their version of who she was supposed to be. What strikes me most about this story is that Monica did not seek revenge in the traditional sense. She did not try to destroy her sister's wedding or publicly humiliate her parents. She simply told the truth. She showed them who she really was and let the consequences of their own lies catch up with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop protecting people from the results of their own behaviour. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if you have ever been the one whose accomplishments went unnoticed, while others received all the praise, know that you are not alone. Your value does not depend on their approval. You have the power to define your own worth and to build a life that reflects who you truly are, not who they expect you to be. I would love to hear your thoughts on Monica's journey. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your family? How did you handle it? What would you have done differently in her situation? Please share your stories and opinions in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else who is going through something similar right now. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the notification bell so you never miss our new stories. We share new content every week, stories about resilience, justice, and the strength it takes to stand up for yourself when no one else will. Thank you for listening, and remember, you deserve to be seen.